The 20mm shells hit clean. Somewhere over the Pas de Calais in the autumn of 1943, a Focke-Wulf 190 pilot lined up a diving attack on a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, squeezed his trigger, and watched the tracers walk across the American fighter's fuselage. Pieces flew off. Coolant, oil, something liquid streaked back in the slipstream. The FW-190 carried 4 wing-mounted 20mm cannons and 2 cowl-mounted 13mm guns, enough firepower to saw a Spitfire in half at close range. The German pilot had done everything right. He had altitude, he had angle, he had hits. The P-47 kept flying. If this kind of story hooks you, the engineering details behind why machines survived what they shouldn't have, then this channel runs on people like you. A like and a subscribe go further than you'd think. And if there's a specific aircraft or engagement you want broken down, drop it in the comments. Not limping. Not trailing smoke in a death spiral toward the channel. Flying. The American rolled hard, pulled into a climb that should have bled the damaged airframe of every knot it had left, and started gaining separation. The FW-190 pilot pushed his throttle forward to follow, and here the problem compounded. Because the P-47, even shot full of holes, accelerated in the dive faster than the Focke-Wulf could match. The German had landed killing blows on a fighter that refused the courtesy of dying. This scene repeated itself across the Western Front with eerie consistency. Different pilots, different squadrons, same result. Luftwaffe aviators trained to expect a certain economy of violence, a burst of 20mm mine shells into a fighter's wing root or engine cowling produced predictable outcomes: structural failure, fire, catastrophic loss of control. Against Spitfires and Hurricanes, this math held. Against Soviet fighters on the Eastern Front, it held even better. The FW-190's armament package represented one of the most lethal air-to-air weapons suites in the European theater, and German pilots trusted it the way a carpenter trusts a hammer. Then, they met the Thunderbolt, and the hammer bounced. The complaints started filtering back to Berlin through Luftwaffe channels almost immediately after the P-47 appeared in force over occupied France. Pilot after-action reports flagged the same anomaly. Confirmed hits on American single-engine fighters, producing no observable kill. The language in these reports carried a specific frustration. Not panic. German fighter pilots in 1943 still possessed considerable skill and confidence. Frustration. The tools they relied on had stopped working against this one aircraft, and nobody in the chain of command could explain why. One Luftwaffe officer's post-war account, recorded as part of the Foreign Military Studies program, put the problem bluntly. The P-47 absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any European-built single-engine fighter, and German pilots began to doubt their own gunnery when their rounds connected, but the target refused to fall. That doubt mattered. A fighter pilot who hesitates on the trigger, who extends his firing pass by half a second to put in extra rounds, exposes himself to exactly the kind of counterattack the Americans excelled at. So what made the Thunderbolt so grotesquely hard to kill? The answer came from American industrial philosophy, colliding with one engineer's obsessive relationship with a turbosupercharger, a combination that produced the heaviest, most absurdly overbuilt single-seat fighter of the entire war. The P-47 weighed over 9,500 pounds empty. For comparison, the FW-190 tipped the scales at roughly 7,000. The Spitfire Mark IX came in under 6,000. Republic Aviation had built something that looked, to European eyes, less like a fighter and more like a medium bomber with ambitions. The Germans noticed the size immediately. They noticed the weight when they watched it dive away from engagements at speeds their own airframes couldn't structurally tolerate. What took them longer to understand? 6 months of identical complaints flowing into Berlin's aviation bureaucracy concerned what all that mass actually contained and why the engineering decisions behind it turned their best weapons into annoyances rather than killing instruments. To understand that, the story has to go back to Long Island, 1940, and a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli, who believed bigger meant better. November 1943. A Luftwaffe staff officer at the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the RLM, Berlin's aviation ministry on Wilhelmstrasse, opened another batch of operational summaries from fighter units stationed across northern France and the Low Countries. The reports arrived on cheap wartime paper, slightly translucent, smelling of mimeograph ink and the particular staleness of documents that had sat in a courier pouch for days. He would have skimmed them quickly. Staff officers always do. But the language in these particular filings kept snagging on the same phrase, repeated across units that had no contact with each other. Confirmed hits, no kill. Jagdgeschwader 2 filed from Beaumont-le-Roger. Jagdgeschwader 26 from Lille-Vendeville. Both units operated the FW-190A series. Both contained veteran pilots with Eastern Front credits, and both reported identical encounters with the big American radial engine fighters, now appearing in growing numbers over the Channel coast. The operational summaries described engagements where German pilots achieved textbook firing solutions, deflection shots at convergence range, sometimes as close as 150 meters, and watched their mine shells detonate against the target's airframe without producing the expected result. No wing separation, no fuel fire, no structural failure of any kind. The file thickened through December. Jagdgeschwader 11, operating from Germany proper on Reich defense duties, added its own entries. These pilots faced P-47s escorting 8th Air Force heavy bombers deep into German airspace, and their complaints carried an additional edge. A Thunderbolt damaged over Dortmund or Bremen still had to fly hundreds of miles back to England, across occupied territory, over the North Sea, in winter weather. The fact that these shot-up fighters made it home at all struck the German pilots as something close to absurd. One Jagdgeschwader 11 summary noted that pilots expended 2 and 3 times their normal ammunition allotment against individual P-47s without achieving destruction. For an Air Force already rationing cannon shells due to production bottlenecks, this represented a material problem layered on top of a tactical one. The American fighter requires an expenditure of ammunition wholly disproportionate to results obtained. That line, or close variants of it, appeared in multiple Luftwaffe operational assessments from late 1943 through early 1944. The FMS files preserve the sentiment, if not always the exact original German phrasing, but the consistency across units tells its own story. These weren't green replacement pilots missing their shots and blaming the aircraft. Staffelkapitän with 40, 60, 80 victories filed the same observation. The P-47 soaked up punishment that killed everything else in the Allied inventory. A staff officer reading these reports in sequence would have confronted an uncomfortable pattern. The Luftwaffe's entire fighter doctrine in the West rested on a simple equation. Find the bomber stream, slash through the escort screen with a fast firing pass, then concentrate on the heavy bombers. That first pass needed to be lethal. German fighters couldn't afford prolonged dogfights with escorts because every second spent turning with a Thunderbolt or Spitfire meant seconds not spent killing B-17s and B-24s. The P-47 broke this equation at the first step. If one pass couldn't destroy an escort fighter, the whole tactical sequence collapsed downstream. Berlin's response moved at bureaucratic speed, slowly, when measured against the daily reality of pilots burning through ammunition over Abbeville and Cambrai. The RLM's technical offices requested gun camera footage. Detailed damage assessments from any P-47 wreckage recovered on French or German soil went on to the requisition list next, followed inevitably by calls for more data, as if the problem might resolve itself through better paperwork. The wreckage that salvage teams did recover only deepened the confusion. Ground crews pulled apart downed Thunderbolts and found airframe construction, unlike anything in the German or British design tradition. The sheer volume of structural material packed into that enormous fuselage, steel tubing, redundant load paths, an engine compartment practically armored by the density of its own components, suggested an aircraft designed less for agility than for survival, which raised a question the RLM's engineers struggled to answer. What kind of Air Force builds a fighter that expects to get hit? A single bullet through a coolant line. That's all it took. Every liquid-cooled fighter engine in the Second World War, the Merlin, the Allison, the Daimler-Benz 605, the Junkers, Jumo 213, carried this identical death sentence somewhere in its plumbing. A glycol water mixture circulated through a closed loop, absorbing heat from the cylinder heads, dumping it through a radiator mounted in the wing or under the fuselage. The system worked beautifully, right up until a single fragment, rifle caliber, shrapnel, even a pebble kicked up on a strafing run, punctured any part of that loop. Coolant sprayed out. Within 90 seconds, sometimes less, cylinder head temperatures climbed past 600 degrees. The engine seized. A liquid-cooled fighter with a hold cooling system didn't limp home. It became a glider with a very poor glide ratio. Every major air force understood this vulnerability. Nobody solved it. The British accepted it as the cost of the Merlin's superior power-to-weight ratio at altitude. The Germans accepted it because inline engines produced narrower frontal profiles, which meant less drag, which meant speed. Fighter design in 1939 through 1942 operated inside a set of trade-offs where survivability always lost the argument to performance. Designers optimized for the kill, not the return trip. Build a fighter that climbs faster, turns tighter, shoots harder than the other side's fighter, and trust pilot skill to avoid getting hit in the first place. Republic Aviation's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, rejected this logic entirely. Born in Tbilisi, educated in Paris, transplanted to Farmingdale, Long Island, Kartveli approached fighter design with a philosophical stubbornness that drove Army Air Force's procurement officers slightly crazy. His argument ran like this: a fighter that gets shot down on its 5th mission contributes less to the war than a fighter that survives 40 missions, even if the second aircraft turns a little wider and climbs a little slower. The math favored the machine that came back, and the single fastest way to build a fighter that came back involved eliminating the liquid cooling system altogether. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp made that possible. This 18-cylinder air-cooled radial generated 2,000 horsepower from a package that used no coolant lines, no radiator, no external plumbing of any kind. Cooling air flowed directly over finned cylinder heads as the aircraft moved through the atmosphere. Shoot a cylinder, and the engine lost power from that cylinder, roughly 1/18 of its total output. Shoot 2 cylinders, and the pilot noticed a vibration, maybe a slight power drop. The R-2800 could sustain catastrophic physical damage to individual cylinders and continue producing enough thrust to fly the aircraft home. Robert S. Johnson, the 56th Fighter Group ace who finished the war with 27 confirmed victories, described bringing a P-47 back to Halesworth with a cylinder shot completely off the engine. I could see the sky through the hole in the cowling. The double wasp kept running on its remaining 17 cylinders, rough and loud and trailing oil, but running. A Merlin with equivalent damage would have been scrap metal in a French field. The engineering was clever in ways that went beyond engine selection. Kartveli didn't just bolt a radial engine onto a conventional airframe. He designed the entire P-47 around the R-2800's survival characteristics, reinforcing them with structural choices that compounded the advantage. The engine itself acted as armor for the pilot. 18 cylinders of forged steel arranged in a circular pattern directly ahead of the cockpit, each one capable of absorbing or deflecting incoming rounds before they reached anything critical behind them. The massive cowling that gave the Thunderbolt its distinctive blunt profile contained an engine that doubled as a shield. Then Kartveli added the turbosupercharger, and in doing so, created the specific engineering puzzle that made the P-47 unlike anything else in the sky. The General Electric turbosupercharger sat behind the pilot, in the rear fuselage, connected to the engine by a run of exhaust ducting and intercooler piping that stretched the entire length of the aircraft. This arrangement demanded a fuselage roughly 5 feet longer than the FW-190's. It added hundreds of pounds of steel tubing and ducting that ran underneath the cockpit floor and along the belly. Tubing that, entirely by accident, created a secondary layer of structural reinforcement between the pilot and the ground. The smell hit first. Anyone who walked through Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant in 1943 caught it immediately. Hot steel, cutting oil, the acrid bite of welding flux hanging in air that the ventilation system never quite cleared. The factory floor stretched over 1,000,000 square feet, and every inch of it fed the production of an aircraft that weighed more than any single-engine fighter had a right to weigh. The turbo ducting alone accounted for a staggering portion of that weight. Exhaust gases left the R-2800 at temperatures exceeding 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, traveled rearward through a steel exhaust pipe running beneath the cockpit floor, spun the turbine wheel of the General Electric supercharger in the aft fuselage, then returned forward through an intercooler before reaching the carburetor as compressed, cooled air. The complete loop ran roughly 12 feet from engine to supercharger and back. 12 feet of high-grade steel tubing, insulated and reinforced, forming a structural backbone that Kartveli never designed as armor, but that functioned as armor nonetheless. A 20mm shell, punching through the belly skin of a P-47, encountered this ducting before it reached the pilot, the fuel lines, or the flight controls. The tubing didn't stop every round. Nothing short of actual armor plate could guarantee that. But it deflected fragments, absorbed energy, and turned what should have been a cockpit kill into a ruptured exhaust pipe and a rough-running supercharger. Republic's own engineering documentation reflects an awareness of this secondary benefit. One internal report from the Farmingdale Design Office noted that the P-47's structural density provides incidental protection exceeding that of purpose-built armor installations on lighter airframes. Their word, incidental, the toughest single-engine fighter of the war, achieved a significant portion of its survivability by accident. Stack the protection layers, and the picture gets absurd. The R-2800 up front, forged steel cylinders acting as an engine-shaped shield. Behind the engine, a firewall of stainless steel. Behind the firewall, the pilot, sitting in a cockpit with an armor plate behind his seat and a bulletproof windscreen in front of his face. Below the cockpit, 12 feet of supercharger ducting. Below the ducting, the belly skin, which on later D-model Thunderbolts gained additional armor plating around the oil cooler. A German 20mm mine shell had to penetrate multiple distinct barriers, each made of different materials at different angles, before it could reach anything that would actually cause the aircraft to stop flying. No other single-seat fighter in any Air Force presented this kind of layered defense. The protection wasn't designed as a system. It emerged from the supercharger layout, the engine choice, and Kartveli's willingness to let the airframe grow until it held everything he wanted. Then, add the firepower. 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, fed by a total of 3,400 rounds of ammunition. The M2 fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second. 8 of them firing simultaneously produced a combined rate of roughly 6,500 rounds per minute, a density of fire that could shred a locomotive or turn an FW-190 into confetti in a 2-second burst. The Thunderbolt carried more ammunition than a B-17's entire defensive suite. Republic built a fighter that hit like a bomber and absorbed punishment like a tank. 15,636 P-47s rolled off production lines at Farmingdale and at the Curtiss Wright plant in Evansville, Indiana. That number dwarfed the production run of any German single-engine fighter variant. The FW-190A series, in all its subtypes combined, reached approximately 13,500 airframes, spread across fighter, fighter-bomber, and ground attack roles on 2 fronts. Republic matched that output with a single model serving a single Air Force and kept accelerating production through 1944, while Luftwaffe output cratered under the weight of Allied strategic bombing. The Germans couldn't kill the P-47 in the air, and they couldn't match its production on the ground. And the reports from France kept arriving on Wilhelmstrasse, all carrying the same unanswered complaint, all describing the same aircraft that wouldn't go down. Colonel Hubert Zemke stood in a briefing room at Boxted, Essex, in January 1944, and told 8th Fighter Command he didn't want their new airplane. The P-51 Mustang, lighter, longer-legged, blessed with the Merlin engine that gave it performance at altitude the Thunderbolt couldn't match, had arrived in theater as the obvious future of American escort doctrine. Every other P-47 group in the 8th Air Force accepted the transition. Zemke's 56th Fighter Group refused. The reasoning sounded almost perverse to the logistics officers processing the conversion orders. The Mustang could fly to Berlin and back. The Thunderbolt couldn't. Not without drop tanks, not without careful fuel management, and even then, its combat radius fell short of what the Merlin-powered P-51 offered as a matter of course. Bomber Command needed escorts over central Germany. The math pointed one direction. Zemke pointed the other. His argument came down to a single operational variable that spreadsheets in England couldn't capture, but gun camera footage from France confirmed daily. The 56th's pilots came home. They came home shot up, oil-streaked, flying on 14 cylinders instead of 18, trailing smoke from holes in the cowling. But they came home. The group's loss rate per sortie ran consistently below every Mustang-equipped unit in the 8th Air Force through the spring of 1944. The file on this sits in the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell, and the numbers are blunt. 56th Fighter Group pilots flew more total sorties, engaged in more combats, lost fewer aircraft to enemy action, and sustained fewer operational casualties than comparable P-51 groups operating in the same airspace during the same period. The Thunderbolt's inability to reach deep targets mattered less when the pilots who did reach medium-range targets kept surviving to fly again the next morning. There's an institutional detail worth noting. Fighter groups didn't just lose airplanes, they lost experience. A pilot shot down over Hanover took with him 500 hours of training, months of combat seasoning, tactical knowledge no replacement fresh from stateside transition could replicate, and a feel for the local Luftwaffe's habits. The 56th understood this at a level that bordered on doctrine. Zemke ran his group around a core of veterans: Francis Gabreski, Robert Johnson, Walker Mahurin, David Schilling, pilots who accumulated kills precisely because they survived long enough to learn the European Air War's rhythms. The P-47 kept them alive through mistakes that would have killed them in any other airframe. Johnson's famous June 1943 engagement, where an FW-190, piloted by probably Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader, riddled his Thunderbolt with over 200 hits without bringing it down, became the group's founding myth for a reason. The airplane forgave errors. Pilots who survived their errors long enough became killers. So what did the 56th actually accomplish by keeping their Thunderbolts? By war's end, 674.5 aerial victories, the highest total of any fighter group in the 8th Air Force. They destroyed an additional 311 aircraft on the ground. They produced more aces than any other American group in the European theater. All of it in an aircraft that the logisticians considered obsolete by mid-1944, in a fighter that couldn't reach half the targets the Mustang reached as a matter of routine. The Luftwaffe noticed which group kept appearing over the Channel coast and the Rhine corridor. German fighter controllers tracked the 56th's call signs and operational patterns with particular attention through the spring and summer of 1944, because Zemke's pilots fought differently than Mustang groups. P-51 escorts stayed with the bombers, weaving above the formation, reacting to threats. The 56th hunted. They swept ahead of the bomber stream at high altitude, dove on German formations before they could organize their attack runs, and broke up interceptions before they started. The Thunderbolt's 850 calibers and dive speed made it devastating in this role, arriving from 28,000 feet in a near-vertical plunge that no FW-190 or BF-109 could match or escape. German pilots assigned to bomber interception over Belgium and Holland learned to check their 6 o'clock compulsively, because the Thunderbolts came from above and behind with a closing speed that left roughly 2 seconds between visual contact and the first burst of API rounds punching through their canopies. 208. That's the count Republic's ground crew tallied on Robert S. Johnson's P-47 after he landed at Manston on June 26, 1943. 208 individual holes from a combination of MG 151 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun rounds. The crew chief walked around the aircraft with a grease pencil, marking each entry point, and ran out of patience somewhere past 200. The final number came from a maintenance report filed the following day, and even that figure carried an asterisk. Several impacts had overlapped, punching through metal already torn open by previous hits, making an exact count impossible. Johnson had tangled with an FW-190 over the Channel coast, likely flown by a pilot from Jagdgeschwader 2, though the German records from that day don't confirm a specific name. The engagement started badly. Johnson's guns jammed, all 850s locked up simultaneously, leaving him in a 7-ton fighter with no offensive capability, pursued by a German pilot who recognized the situation and pressed his advantage with the calm precision of a man conducting target practice. The Focke-Wulf closed to what Johnson later estimated as 70 yards. At that distance, a 20mm mine shell doesn't just puncture aluminum. It detonates inside the skin, peeling metal outward in jagged petals, scattering fragments through the airframe's interior spaces. The German pilot fired in disciplined bursts. Rounds walked across the fuselage and chewed through the tail section before shattering the canopy. Johnson felt impacts through the seat and the rudder pedals, through the stick and up his arms. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his legs. The turbo ducting beneath his feet absorbed hits that should have reached his body, steel exhaust piping doing exactly what Kartveli never designed it to do, catching fragments and deflecting shrapnel away from the cockpit floor. The FW-190 made repeated passes. Johnson counted at least 3 separate attack runs, each one delivering another cluster of cannon and machine gun fire into an airframe that, by every reasonable expectation, should have come apart over the English Channel. His instrument panel went dark. The trim tabs stopped responding. The canopy frame bent inward from a direct 20mm hit, jamming the sliding mechanism shut, trapping Johnson inside a cockpit he couldn't bail out of, even if he'd wanted to. At some point, the German pilot pulled alongside and flew formation with Johnson's shattered Thunderbolt, close enough that Johnson could see the man's face through his canopy. The German stared at the P-47, at the holes, the missing skin panels, the oil streaming from the cowling, the control surfaces hanging at wrong angles, and the expression, as Johnson described it years later in his memoir, carried something between frustration and disbelief. The FW-190 pilot had expended his ammunition. He'd hit the American fighter with everything his aircraft carried, and the American fighter continued to fly. The German broke away. Johnson nursed the Thunderbolt across the Channel at reduced power, the R-2800 running rough but running, and put the aircraft down at Manston, an emergency field on the Kent coast built specifically for damaged bombers and fighters that couldn't make it back to their home stations. The landing gear extended. The brakes worked. Johnson walked away from an airplane that looked like it had been fed through an industrial shredder. Republic's damage assessment team examined the aircraft over the following week. Their report noted structural failures in the horizontal stabilizer, severed hydraulic lines in 3 separate locations, a punctured oil tank that had lost roughly 60% of its capacity, and damage to 9 of the 18 cylinders on the R-2800. 9 cylinders hit, half the engine, and the double wasp produced enough power on the remaining 9 to maintain controlled flight for over 40 minutes. The report uses the phrase continued serviceability under extreme combat damage. I think that undersells it considerably. The FW-190 pilot flew back to his base in France and filed whatever report Jagdgeschwader 2 required for a combat engagement. The records don't preserve his words, but his ammunition expenditure told the story plainly enough. A full combat load of 20mm and 7.92 fired at close range into a single-engine fighter, resulting in 0 kills. The complaint that had been filling Berlin's mailbox for months landed that afternoon in one pilot's lived experience. What does a Jagdflieger write in his after-action report when he's fired every round his aircraft carries into a single-engine fighter and watched it fly away? The Luftwaffe's Quartermaster General files from late 1943 contain a pattern so repetitive it reads like a clerical error. Unit after unit along the Channel coast, Jagdgeschwader 2, Jagdgeschwader 26, elements of Jagdgeschwader 11 rotating through France, submitted combat reports describing engagements with P-47s, in which confirmed hits produced no confirmed kills. The language varied, the substance didn't. Pilots reported observing strikes, smoke, debris, fluid trails, followed by the American aircraft continuing to maneuver and fight, or diving away toward England at speeds the FW-190 couldn't sustain below 10,000 feet. The RLM's technical branch acknowledged receipt of these reports. They forwarded summaries to Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf's armament divisions. And then, nothing. For 6 months, from roughly October 1943 through March 1944, the operational units along the Channel received no new weapons, no revised tactics bulletins, no modified ammunition types arrived either. The file at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg thins out conspicuously during this window. Someone either stopped writing responses or stopped preserving them. The pilots adapted on their own. Headquarters had gone quiet, and frontline soldiers fill that silence with improvisation. Anecdotal evidence from post-war FMS interrogations suggests that experienced Jagdgeschwader, 2 pilots shifted their attack profiles against Thunderbolts during this period, abandoning the standard stern quarter curve of pursuit in favor of high deflection shots aimed at the engine cowling from the 10 o'clock or 2 o'clock position. The logic held a grim arithmetic. If 20mm mine shells couldn't penetrate the layered protection along the fuselage spine, then the only viable kill zone sat forward, where rounds could enter the cowl flaps at an angle that bypassed the exhaust ducting entirely and struck the R-2800's accessory section, magnetos, fuel pump, oil lines clustered in a tight package behind the propeller reduction gear. A hit there could starve the engine of fuel or oil before the pilot recognized the failure. But high deflection shooting against a target crossing at 300 miles per hour required marksmanship that most Luftwaffe pilots in early 1944 simply didn't possess anymore. The men who could make that shot, the expert 10, the old hands from 1940 and 41, had been ground down by 2 years of attrition over Russia, North Africa, and the Reich's own skies. Their replacements arrived at Channel Coast units with 60 to 80 hours of flight training. The Jagdfliegerschulen had cut their programs nearly in half by late 43, hemorrhaging instructor pilots to frontline duty as the manpower crisis deepened. These replacement pilots could barely maintain formation in clear weather. Asking them to execute a 40-degree deflection shot against a diving Thunderbolt at convergence ranges under 200 yards bordered on fantasy. So the complaint cycle fed itself. Green pilots fired from astern because that's all their training covered. Astern attacks struck the P-47's most heavily protected aspects: belly, fuselage spine, tail section. Hits registered, but kills didn't. Reports flowed to Berlin describing an American fighter that absorbed punishment beyond anything in the Luftwaffe's operational experience. Berlin's silence continued because no solution existed within the production and training constraints of a Reich already buckling under strategic bombardment. The Mark 108 30mm cannon, which packed enough kinetic energy to crack a Thunderbolt spar in a single hit, wouldn't reach frontline fighter units in meaningful numbers until the Me-262 entered service in the autumn of 1944, 9 months after the complaints peaked and far too late to matter over Normandy. I think that delay killed more Luftwaffe pilots than any American ace did. Every month without an answer meant another cycle of green replacements flying outdated attack profiles against an airframe specifically engineered, partly by design, partly by beautiful accident, to survive exactly those attacks. The P-47 didn't just absorb German cannon fire. It absorbed German institutional failure and converted it into pilot attrition, which fed back into the next month's training deficit. A spiral with no exit. Berlin's mailbox kept filling because Berlin never emptied it. The Thunderbolt that Berlin couldn't kill in the air became, by the summer of 1944, the most destructive ground attack platform on the Western Front. The same airframe that shrugged off 20mm cannon fire at 25,000 feet now carried 2 500-pound bombs and 10 5-inch HVAR rockets down to treetop level over Normandy's hedgerow country, and the Wehrmacht had even less answer for it on the deck than they'd had at altitude. German infantry experienced the P-47 as sound first. A low, throbbing growl that rose from behind a tree line or ridge line with almost no warning. The R-2800 at combat power, pushing the aircraft across the ground at 350 miles per hour, roughly 500 feet per second, which meant the interval between first hearing the engine and the first rocket impact measured in single digits. Then came the smell: cordite, burning fuel, hot metal, the particular acrid stink of white phosphorus if the rockets carried incendiary warheads. Soldiers in open positions along the road south of St. Lo described the Thunderbolts arriving in pairs, or fours, releasing their ordnance in shallow dives that began barely 1,000 feet above the ground, then pulling up and circling back with those 850 calibers, raking anything still moving. The 50 caliber M2 Browning fired API rounds that penetrated the top armor of every German half-track and most light armored vehicles in the Normandy theater. A single P-47 carried enough ammunition for roughly 15 seconds of sustained fire across all 8 guns, 3,400 rounds total. 15 seconds doesn't sound like much until the math lands. That's over 60 rounds per second, striking a convoy column, each round carrying enough energy at convergence range to punch through an inch of rolled homogeneous steel. The FMS series preserves what German officers thought of this. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer-Lehr Division during Operation Cobra in late July 1944, provided testimony after the war that has become one of the most cited passages in the entire Foreign Military Studies collection. His division occupied positions along the Saint-Lô, Perrier Road when the carpet bombing began on July 25th. The heavy bombers broke the defensive line. The fighter bombers finished it. After an hour, I had no Gruppen any longer, Bayerlein stated. My front line looked like the face of the moon, and at least 70% of my troops were out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. Panzer-Lehr had entered Normandy as one of the Wehrmacht's premier armored formations, fully equipped, experienced, lavished with the latest Panther and Panzer IV variants. Bayerlein watched it disintegrate under American air power in a single afternoon. The Thunderbolts, operating as part of 9th Tactical Air Command, flew sortie after sortie against the retreating columns, catching vehicles nose to tail on roads too narrow to disperse from, hitting fuel trucks that turned entire convoys into funeral pyres visible for miles. The aircraft that made this possible carried the same engineering Kartveli had packed into the original design for entirely different reasons. Turbo ducting that saved pilots from cannon fragments at altitude now protected them from small arms fire rising from hedgerows. That radial engine kept running on 9 cylinders after aerial combat, and it kept running after ground fire clipped a cylinder or two during strafing passes. At over 9,500 pounds empty, the airframe's sheer mass gave the P-47 a stability in low-altitude turbulence that lighter fighters couldn't match, which translated directly into bombing and rocket accuracy during shallow-angle attacks. Pilots could hold their dive lines longer, release closer, correct later, and squeeze off bursts that lighter platforms would have scattered. The airplane that absorbed punishment also delivered it with a precision that its bulk seemed to contradict. German troops developed a vocabulary for the Jabos, the fighter bombers that owned the daylight hours over France after June 6th. Wiretaps from Trent Park captured General Major Robert Waller telling a fellow prisoner in August 1944 that movement by day had become simply impossible. The fighter bombers are everywhere. The word he used, überall, carried a weight that transcended geography. Not just overhead, everywhere, on every road and at every crossroads, above every column that dared move before nightfall. The complaint had migrated from Berlin's filing cabinets to the front lines themselves, and the airframe at its center remained the same one that wouldn't die. We reported. We waited. Nothing came back. General Major Dietrich Peltz, interviewed by American intelligence officers in 1945, compressed 6 months of institutional paralysis into 7 words. Peltz had commanded Angriffsführer England, the Luftwaffe's offensive bomber force against Britain, but his staff maintained close liaison with the Channel Coast fighter units, and the complaints about the P-47 crossed his desk alongside everything else. The file grew. The responses didn't. The RLM's silence wasn't laziness. It mirrored a dysfunction rotting through every branch of the Reich's war machinery by late 1943, and tracing that rot requires a brief detour into how German military bureaucracy actually processed technical complaints. The system, on paper, functioned elegantly. Frontline units submitted Erfahrungsberichte, experience reports, through their Geschwader staffs to the appropriate General Luftzeugmeister department, which coordinated with industry to develop solutions, then pushed modifications back down through supply channels, responsive and logical, on paper. Except by the autumn of '43, the General Luftzeugmeister's office had been reorganized twice in 18 months. Erhard Milch lost control of aircraft production to Albert Speer's Armaments Ministry in the spring. Technical authority fractured between competing fiefdoms, Speer's planners, Göring's favorites, the SS's increasingly aggressive grabs at war production. A complaint about 20mm effectiveness against American fighters had to navigate at least 4 separate bureaucratic jurisdictions before reaching anyone with authority to order a change in ammunition specification or weapon caliber. The file at Freiburg doesn't record which jurisdiction killed the response. It simply records the absence, back to the Channel coast. While Berlin's offices shuffled paper between reorganized departments, Jagdgeschwader 26 lost 41 pilots between October 1943 and March 1944. 41. Not all fell to Thunderbolts. Mustangs, Lightnings, bomber defensive fire, and operational accidents claimed their share, but the unit's own records attribute a disproportionate number of losses to engagements where pilots pressed attacks against P-47 formations, expended their ammunition without achieving kills, then found themselves low on energy and vulnerable to the American wingmen they'd ignored during the firing pass. The Thunderbolt's survivability didn't just protect American pilots, it extended engagement times, which drained German energy states, which exposed German aircraft to counterattack. Every second, a Jagdflieger spent pumping rounds into an airframe that refused to fall apart added another second of fuel burn and decreasing airspeed, while the Americans' flight lead or wingman rolled in from above with 850 calibers, converging at 300 yards. The P-47 killed by not dying. Peltz understood this. His post-war testimony describes a meeting. He placed it in early 1944, though the exact date stays vague, where fighter commanders from the Western Front presented their case directly to representatives of the General Luftzeugmeister's technical staff. The request centered on accelerating deployment of the MG-213, a 13mm weapon with higher velocity than the 7.92, or fast-tracking the Mark 108 30mm cannon into single-engine fighter installations. The technical staff's response, as Peltz recalled it, production priorities had already been allocated through the second quarter. No capacity existed for retrofit programs. The conversation ended there. 41 pilots from a single Geschwader in 6 months, and the answer amounted to wait until the production schedule permits. I think Peltz's 7 words, "We reported, we waited, nothing came back," captured something beyond frustration. They captured the moment. A professional military organization recognized that its own administrative machinery had become as much an enemy as the aircraft it couldn't shoot down. The Thunderbolt absorbed cannon shells through redundant engineering. The RLM absorbed complaints through redundant bureaucracy. But where Republic's system converted damage into survival, the Reich's converted information into silence. Republic Aviation in Farmingdale built 15,686 P-47s by war's end. The RLM never produced a single document answering the complaint that started arriving in the autumn of 1943. 6 months of identical reports from pilots who watched their shells detonate against an American fighter and saw it fly home. And the institution responsible for solving the problem dissolved into reorganization charts and jurisdiction disputes, while its pilots died in the gap between the question asked and the answer that never came. Colonel Hubert Zemke filed his last mission report from Boxted on August 19, 1944, before transferring to command the 479th Fighter Group and its Mustangs. His 56th Fighter Group, The outfit that refused to give up the Thunderbolt had by then destroyed more German aircraft than any other unit in 8th Fighter Command. They'd done it in the airplane every planning document said couldn't keep up. The numbers back him. Across the entire European theater, the P-47 flew more combat sorties than any other American fighter, 546,000 by VE Day. It dropped more bomb tonnage than the P-51 and P-38 combined, and it posted the lowest loss rate per sortie of any USAAF fighter in the ETO, 0.7%. 7 aircraft lost per 1,000 sorties flown. The Mustang, for all its range and elegance, lost aircraft at a higher rate. The Lightning lost them at nearly double. Republic's enormous, overbuilt, absurdly heavy creation, the one that looked wrong on paper and flew like a freight train in a phone booth below 15,000 feet, brought more pilots home than anything else the Army Air Forces put into European skies. 15,686 airframes rolled off the lines at Farmingdale and Evansville. The production volume alone constituted a strategic weapon the Reich couldn't match or even conceptualize. Germany built roughly 36,000 Bf-109 variants across the entire war, spread across every front from Norway to North Africa. The United States built nearly 16,000 copies of a single model of a single fighter and sent most of them to a single theater. Surplus as doctrine, abundance as tactics, waste as acceptable cost. When a Thunderbolt took 200 hits over the Channel and limped back to England trailing oil, Republic didn't need to repair it. They shipped another one. The crate arrived by sea from New York, and a crew at an air depot in southern England had it flying within 72 hours. The replacement pipeline never broke. German intelligence knew the production figures, or close approximations, by mid-1944. The ultra-intercepts show Luftwaffe Quartermaster staff adjusting loss projections upward every quarter, and the adjustments never caught reality. They consistently underestimated how many P-47s would appear over France the following month. The grim irony sits in the archives at Freiburg, filed alongside those unanswered complaints. The Luftwaffe's own documentation became the P-47's most persuasive performance review. Neither American press releases, nor Republic Aviation advertisements, nor congressional testimony carried the authority of a German pilot reporting, in an official channel, to his own command structure, that he'd hit an enemy fighter with everything he had and watched it fly away. The FMS interrogations after the war added another layer. German officers describing the Jabos used language reserved for natural disasters, omnipresent, impossible to plan against. Bayerlein's testimony about Panzer Lehr reads like a man describing a flood, not a battle. Waller's Überall at Trent Park carried the cadence of surrender months before the paperwork caught up. These men validated the Thunderbolt's design thesis more convincingly than Alexander Kartveli ever could have, because they validated it against their own interests. A hostile witness confirming the prosecution's case. The file at Freiburg covering the Channel Coast Fighter Unit's complaints from October 1943 through March 1944 still contains no response document. Researchers have looked. The gap persists. Whatever internal correspondence may have existed between the RLM's technical branch and the General Luftzeugmeister's fractured departments either never generated a written reply or generated one that someone discarded before the Americans captured the archive in 1945. Sources conflict on which explanation fits. Somewhere over the Pas de Calais, in the autumn of '43, an FW-190 pilot lined up a diving attack on a Thunderbolt, pressed his trigger, watched his tracers strike home, and saw the American keep flying. He landed, taxied to his dispersal point, climbed out of the cockpit, and walked to the operations building to write it up. A clerk bundled his report with 11 others describing the same thing. The package went to Berlin. Across the Channel, the American pilot he'd hit landed on a grass strip in Kent, shut down his battered R-2800, and filed his own report. Then, he walked to the mess for dinner.